It isn't till you get up there that you realise how big Clacton-on-Sea really is. In fact, it's three places. Clacton in the middle, with Holland-on-Sea at one end and Jaywick Sands at the other.
Hello, my name's Carl, and thank you for taking the time to find and listen to this episode of Sunspot Stories. The Sunspot was an amusement arcade and local landmark in the seaside resort of Jaywick in Essex where I grew up. The Sunspot has been a litmus to the area that it was built in. In the early years it was an arcade and bingo hall with a cafe and gift shop that served many thousands of holiday makers that visit the area from London and the South East. It was also visited by the owners of the chalets in the Plotland estate of Brooklands where the arcade was actually built. Its fortunes have closely shadowed the changing classification of Jaywick Sands from resort to residential area that began during the post-war period. This podcast series will tell the stories of this now deleted landmark, its machines, and discover what the Sunspot meant to people. When I moved to Jaywick in 1983, the area boasted at least 7 amusement arcades. These were a natural draw to a boy like me, and I pestered my parents for 10p to visit these halls and try my skills on machines like Pac-Man and Space Invaders. I could hardly see over the top of the controls, and my 3 lives and 10p were often lost too quickly. But the most distinctive of all these arcades was the Sunspot. It was a large yellow single-storey building that had an odd-looking tower on its side. The tower was about 8 metres high and was capped with a swooshing roof. It looked like a huge ramp, and it was illuminated with a string of light bulbs along its edge. To me, the building looked futuristic and quite out of place. To my 8-year-old self, it would not have looked out of place in Mos Eisley. When looking into the history of the site, plans at the Essex Records Office show that the application for alterations was made to Clacton Urban District Council in 1938. They were submitted by Palladium Jaywick Limited, and this was the original name of the arcade, and there are pictures from the early 1950s that have this name displayed on the sloping roof of the tower. The application indicates there was already an amusement arcade and these alterations were for a tower. The architect listed in the plans was a Frank Ernest Bromige. When I searched his name, I was amazed to find other examples of his work. Bromige in the 1930s had become a prolific architect, especially building projects in northwest London. His specialism was modernist designs, buildings that looked futuristic that would suit the landscape of Fritz Lang's metropolis. Some examples of his work are now Grade 2 listed, and Bromige's work is now cited as a typical example of modernist architecture. Not much is known about the man, nor if he was well received at the time, or indeed what he did later in life. So I was lucky to have some time with Bruce Peter, Professor of Design History at the Glasgow School of Art, who was kind enough to share what he knows about Bromige, and we discuss his life, methods and philosophy. I began by asking Bruce how he became interested in Bromige.
Well, I got interested in Bromige when I was at the Royal College of Art in London. That was in the mid-90s, and it was the time when it was the centenary of cinema shows. And I assisted with a nationwide in looking at documenting what survived of cinema buildings. There was an organization that was very interested, a heritage group or public amenity group called the Cinema Theatre Association. And I went on a lot of tours and trips with them to look at old cinemas, most of which had become bingo halls and other things, largely bingo halls actually, which was good because the ones that had gone over to bingo had actually been really rather well preserved, whereas the ones that had continued as cinemas had usually been horribly subdivided inside in order to make multiple screens, but it had been done in a cheap and shoddy way. Mm-hmm. And I was very taken by a series that Bromige had designed in West London. There was a beautiful one at Rayner's Lane, and there was a bigger cinema, the Dominion at Acton, and there was also one at Harrow, which was all overclad in corrugated metal, but underneath the corrugated metal there was a really fantastic exterior, which had been, I guess it probably was quite maintenance heavy, and in the 60s also, as you say, passé, so they just overclad it. So I mean, I thought he'd done fabulous work, and then I was asked by the Cinema Theatre Association, that kind of annual journal it produced, very good, called Picture House, which was an attempt to seriously write about different aspects of cinema design and cinema going in Britain. So the editor of that was a lovely man called Alan Isles, asked me if I would write an article on F.E. Bromige, which I did, and I got in touch with his granddaughter, I think it was, who was she was a pretty elderly lady herself, and she told me a fair bit about his early career and background. But essentially they were sort of a normal London Jewish middle-class family, and he studied architecture on the job, essentially, as many did. You know, it was quite usual. You'd be an apprentice working in an architect's office. They worked in Paddington. And he became, fortuitously, in the late 20s, he became involved in designing cinema buildings, working for Clifford Aish, who was another London-based architect specializing in more and more in cinemas. And that was lucky, of course, because when the Wall Street crash happened and the Great Depression began, it was extremely difficult for architects to find any work at all, because the economy just ground to a halt. And so jobs were hard to come by. But Bromige, because he already has his foot over the door, one might say, as a designer specializing in cinemas, had happened into one of the few areas where there was a degree of expansion. So he specialized in those. But I think the important thing is that in those really difficult years in the first half of the 1930s, you know, one couldn't pick and choose what one designed. And he took any job that would come along, you know, and once he kind of developed a network of acquaintances in the leisure and entertainment industry, which, you know, often local cinemas were also involved, run by show families, fairground families. So one gets a certain interconnectivity between cinemas and amusement arcades and greyhound racing stadia and all of these sorts of attraction. So he designed other things. Until you contacted me, I had no clue about that amusement arcade. It was one of his things that I simply didn't know existed or that he'd been involved in, and I suspect it was one of several.
Yes, I think you mentioned that there may be a sister site somewhere down on the south coast at a Greyhound Stadium that you may have seen that looks similar.
Which has now been demolished, or it was there in a pretty ramshackle condition in the early 2000s. So in places that had kind of stagnated, and that had meant that things that were, you know, not perhaps economically terribly viable, but they kind of still hung on just about. Then when that huge economic boom happened in the late 90s and early 2000s, suddenly one had house builders and, you know, other entrepreneurs who saw things like Greyhound Stadia and saw them as ripe for making something more lucrative.
PFI, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's it. Yeah.
So I don't know when it disappeared, but I more recent time when I was in Portsmouth, I happened to be driven past it, I think, in a taxi bound for a ferry, and saw that it had gone. And that there was, I think, new housing or something else on the site where it stood. But I mean, it was in a pretty rubbishy condition, and you know, other than a small part of it, most of it was built of the most basic materials. It did have a little sort of tower, which was, I think, the control building, but most of the rest of it was just done in corrugated metal, and you know, but what was used.
It's So yeah, I've the Sunspot obviously was built with like a timber construction with sort of rendering on the outside to give it more of a solidic appearance. But it was a sort of a local landmark in the area for its modern swooshing roof, and no one really knew too much about it. So it was. I've certainly never known about the architect behind the design, and it surprised me in a very nice way that his work at Harrow Dominion, which was clad in sort of like a brutalist cladding, just to keep it maintenance free. When that comes away, it turns into sort of like a beautiful modernist building again. And
it's being converted into flats at the moment. Thankfully.
Yes.
I think it should be quite a nice project, as I understand. But the proof will be when it's all revealed. But from what I could gather, just looking on Google, it looked as if it was going to be quite well done. There were also a whole lot on the North Cape coast. I mean, there were Whitstable and various other Sheerness, I think. There were other small cinemas that he designed.
Well, so how was Bromige received in his time of activity? Was he known? Was he the game in town for a modernist building?
No, not at all, no. One would say that architecture is a pretty snobbish profession. And in London, there's a kind of architectural establishment. And the people who are in that establishment, who are often the ones who write for the professional journals like the Architectural Review and the Architect's Journal, have a belief that architecture is, it's the mother of the arts. It's an ancient profession that can date its past back to, ancient Greece and Rome, and to the Etruscans and the Egyptians, and to, sort of grand history from there forward. And they in the 1920s and 30s had a notion that modern architecture was about more than just building buildings. They had a notion that modern architecture, if it was done properly, had the potential to completely reform society and to transform the conditions of the working classes, and to bring people to live in spectacular and transformative environments full of up-to-date technology and modern conveniences, indoor bathrooms, fitted kitchens, central heating, balconies to sunbathe, all of that sort of thing. And the kind of heroes, I guess, were some of the progressive continental architects, people who you've heard of, like Le Corbusier was probably the most famous, the Swiss-French architect. And by comparison, Bromige was frankly a nobody. He was a young man whose name few had heard of, and who was doing commercial work, kind of more on the fringes of the profession. And he was doing it very well. And he was producing fashionable buildings for commercial clients, but clients who had very tight budgets. So rather than making often the whole building in an up-to-date aesthetic and spending money on style, he often simply made a very basic building and then put an exotic front on it.
That takes us back to the Sunspot, because that's exactly what it is.
Absolutely.
It's a hangar building with a modernist tower coming out of it. And,
that's exactly what he did. I think another interesting thing that's maybe harder for me to talk about is also that there was a parallel between his work and that done by certain Jewish modern architects in Berlin in the 1920s. And a very famous one who actually came to Britain as a refugee was Eric Mendelssohn, who went on to design the Delaware Pavilion at Bexhill, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's worth looking at. It's very, very beautiful. But of course, the Delaware Pavilion was paid for by wealthy local aristocrats who happened to be the local landowner there, Earl Delaware. And so the budget was not colossal, but it wasn't as tight as the budget that a showman would have for making an amusement arcade, or a London cinema owner would have in the early 30s for making a new cinema. But for these people, it was a question more of doing it cheaply and for maximum profitability. And of course, that kind of thing is the antithesis of what the architectural establishment would think, in their view, would be good architecture. Good architecture should be buildings that would be of high quality materials and with the design. There would be no particular facade. They would look good from whichever angle you looked at them. Whereas Bromige, it was a question of spend the money where most people would see it and where it would have the biggest effect on profitability, which was usually over the entrance door. So in a way, I mean, he was designing in Britain, you could say, really American architecture. If you think about the American commercial strip, if you think about most American downtown commercial districts, and already in the 1930s, there a large number of people were car owners. So commercial buildings were designed to attract attention from passing cars. So they typically had pile-on name signs,
like drive-throughs and things like that.
Drive-throughs and diners, and even banks and electricity showrooms and quite mundane buildings. We tend to think of this being an aesthetic that was applied to cinemas in Britain, which it absolutely was. But in America, the same look, if you look at an American commercial high street in the 30s or in the 50s, it's very difficult to tell what's a cinema and what's a shop. And, they all had more or less the same approach of a big neon lit Art Deco or modern sign on the front. So Bromige was doing that here for strictly commercial reasons, and of course the cinema and amusements and all of these things were by the 30s extremely American influenced.
So EP was somewhat of a visionary, but wasn't quite recognised in his own tenure. What else did he go on to do? When did he sort of move on to anything else at all?
Yeah, after the war, I mean, he became an architect of, I think, Stead and Simpson and Etam and W.H. Smith shops in West London, so it's Ruislip and Ealing and
Metroland, really.
Yeah, the same kinds of places he designed cinemas. But I mean, after the war again, there's a problem that until the mid-50s in Britain, there was pretty strict materials rationing. And so that meant that these also had to be pretty minimal buildings, that they usually were less exciting than the 1930s ones. They didn't have particularly, demonstrative frontages. They were usually just sort of brick with some windows and
utilitarian sort of thing. Just needs to go up quickly and serve the function, I guess. Yeah.
And of course, there was in West London, I mean, nowhere near as bad as in the east and near the docks and so on. But in West London, there were still some gap sites occasionally caused by random bombs being offloaded. And so one had a little bit of work doing infill projects to build new shop units or whatever, where that was the case. And then I guess he retired, and he seemed to die, I think, in the late 70s, got retired in the 50s, and lived until into the 1970s. So, I mean, I think one could say that he was somebody who, like many of his generation, was very aspiring. He was somebody from a relatively modest background who worked incredibly hard and was a very good designer. I mean, he was, it takes real skill to have a strict budget and to actually get maximum effect out of it. And he produced, if there was a little bit of leeway, he produced some quite spectacular results. But he was extremely unlucky for the bulk of his professional career to be, first of all, through the Depression, then through the Second World War, and then through post-war rationing. So he never actually had much of an opportunity to design in a time of real prosperity.
And that's quite an interesting parallel with the Brooklands estate that it's cited on, and the Second World War, because after the Second World War, the plot lands where aspiring people would buy a plot, build their house and live by the sea for a holiday, these dwellings turned into permanent fixtures because people came from the East End and stayed there and never returned back to the East End, and that's when really the resort turned into a de facto residential area, and that's where the deprivation came in. So it is strange that the war did for Bromige as what it did for the Brooklands estate and the social area in general, you could say.
But I mean, I guess conditions in Essex were a heck of a lot better than in places like Deptford and some of the
exactly. There was
Bethnal Green,
and that's where a lot of the people do hail from. And but no, thank you very much. And if you ever want any more, any more thoughts about the Sunspot, hopefully I'll be able to help in the future. Or
that's fantastic. And just keep your ear to the ground, and if you come across anything more, it would actually be fascinating to know how much he designed, because and I mean an intriguing thing is how projects were got. I mean, was it word of mouth, or how did somebody who was initially based in Paddington and then seemed to move out to Metroland, I don't know exactly when, but somebody who was basically a West London person ended up working in Essex and North Kent to such a degree.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Take care of yourself. Have a good bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was Professor Bruce Peter from the Glasgow School of Art sharing some thoughts about F.E. Bromige. I would like to thank him again for contributing to this podcast, and just with some final thoughts on how a promising architect was perhaps having his career curtailed by the Second World War, lack of materials after the Second World War, and then having to go and build to specification during the Great Depression as well. Things could have been so different maybe for Bromige. However, I'm so pleased that we managed to find out that there was a tower that he built, and he brought a little bit more class to the area. When it was built, it was probably an area of optimism and probably a totem of leisure maybe. Anyway, if anyone else has got any more thoughts about the Sunspot, please do email sunspotstories@gmail.com, and I'll be looking forward to sharing them in future episodes. Well, that's it from me today, and I hope you've enjoyed it all. And thanks, and I'll see you again in the future. Bye-bye.
Baffling, isn't it? This mechanical masterpiece which only the scientists really understand. Frightening, too, for this invention, this brainchild of the boffins, has created a new disease, the slot machine fever.